Okay, this is Auntie Claus Part 2, the last half. For weeks, Sophie looked high and low for Auntie Claus, but now it was almost Christmas Eve and she had turned up nothing. Sophie was worried. If she didn't find Auntie Claus, how would she get home? If she didn't get home, how will I get all my Christmas presents, she thought. Just then Mr. Pudding appeared. There he is. Hello, Elf Sophie, he said. Good news. You have excelled in the mailroom and may proceed to package wrapping. After that, we'll all pitch in on sleigh packing. I'm not going to package wrapping. I'm not going to sleigh packing. I want to go home, Sophie yelled. I have to get all my... But before she could finish, Santa's voice interrupted over the PA system. Oh, another one sideways. It's that time of year again, his voice boomed, and I was hoping one of you would volunteer to go to the coal mines and pick up the BB&G list. Sophie whispered to Mr. Pudding. What's the BB&G list? BB&G, he shivered, is short for bad boys and girls. Any boy or girl on that list goes without presents, or worse, for Christmas. Sophie swallowed hard. Uh-oh, she thought. Mr. Pudding continued. Only the bravest elf would volunteer for such an awful job. Yes, a brave elf, thought Sophie, or else a girl who thinks she might be on that list. She raised her hand high. I'll go, she said. Oh dear, Mr. Pudding said, as Sophie made her way toward the coal mines. She could hear the chanting of the BB&G elves. Spoiled brats and crybabies, wine babies, and all the ones who don't believe. Here's some coal and here's some gunk. Fill a stocking that smells like skunk. Sophie went down, 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 where it became darker and darker. All the way down there. Finally, she hit the very bottom. There was the list. Sophie looked for her name, but it wasn't her name she saw on the list. It was... My own little brat of a brother, she cried. Chris is on the bad boys and girls list. Well, she thought, once she'd gotten past the shock of it, Well, she thought once she'd gotten past the shock of it, they do kind of have a point. But then she pictured the two of them on Christmas morning. There would be lots of presents for her and nothing for her little brother. On his favorite day of the year, Chris would find only a stinky stocking filled with coal and gunk. He will be so disappointed. He will be so sad, Sophie said. She quickly erased his name, but now there was a large telltale gap. Sophie took a deep breath and wrote down her own name instead. The ink wasn't even dry on the page when some kind of really strong magic happened. Right before her eyes, the list, the BB&G elves, and the coal mines vanished, and Sophie was whirling around and around, hurling through the air in a blur of Christmas red and green. What was up? What was down? Whoops, there we go. Sophie was standing on the stage of the grand ballroom. A clock struck midnight. Santa began to speak. She's always on time. She works harder than anyone I know, including me. Ho, ho, ho. In short, she does things right, and I would be lost without her. Let's have a big round of applause for my sister. The curtain opened. Auntie Claus, Sophie shouted. Auntie Claus, everyone cheered. Hooray for Auntie Claus. Turning to Sophie, Auntie Claus winked and said, Come along, darling, you must be home in time for Christmas. There she is with Santa and the elves. She looks shocked, doesn't she? Looks like Santa's in his sleigh, and there's Sophie and Auntie Claus. Sophie was about to climb onto the sleigh when Mr. Pudding appeared. He was waving the green and red book in the air. Oh dear, he cried. Auntie Claus, Sophie can't leave until she knows the first and final rule. See, it says so right here under departing procedures." The reindeer stomped restlessly and shook their heads as if to say, "Let's go, let's go." "Sophie knows the first and final rule?" Mr. Pudding, Auntie Claus said. "I do?" asked Sophie. "Yes, you do. Now hop onto the sleigh. There's a good girl." Sophie jumped onto the sleigh and it rose into the sky. "Goodbye, goodbye," she called. She could barely hear her aunt's voice over the wind and the snow. "I knew you had it in you. Merry Christmas, darling." The sleigh picked up speed. "Ho, ho, ho," Santa laughed as the stars whizzed by. Sophie closed her eyes. Her face stung with a cold. Oh, there's her brother with all the presents. When Sophie opened her eyes, she could hardly believe she was in her own bed again. She ran down the stairs toward the living room. "Please let him get his presents," she whispered to herself. Under the tree was her little brother. His cheeks were red, his eyes were sparkled, and his belly shook with laughter. "Merry Christmas, Sophie," he bellowed. "Merry Christmas, Chris," Sophie said with great relief. It was then that she realized Auntie Claus is right. "I do know the first and final rule," she said to herself. "It's far better to give than to receive." "There is something for you," her mother and father said proudly. They handed Sophie a tiny box with a card. Inside was a diamond key hanging from a red ribbon. "It's from Auntie Claus," said Sophie. "Where is Auntie Claus anyway?" Chris piped up. On a business trip, darling," Sophie said and smiled mysteriously. Suddenly a thought occurred to Chris. "She's never here on Christmas," he said. "What kind of business is she in anyway?" "That is something for me to know and you to find out," Sophie said to her little butterball of a brother. And someday he would, but that's another story. The end. There's the key, huh?